Wow, I didn't anticipate such a crowd, but that's wonderful. Thank you very much for coming. And sorry about the transition. So today, will this be okay, or shall we dim some lights, or? Well, okay. So we're going to talk about the Underground Railroad in Iowa City and in, pardon? I don't think so. I think that's about it. That'll be great, thank you. So what was the impact of the Underground Railroad in Iowa City and in Iowa? Well, from the beginning of time, I guess you'd probably figure, man has chosen to enslave his fellow man. This practice was carried out in many parts of the world. Various peoples in Africa chose to enslave fellow Africans. So don't think of it as just the Americans, of course, and we remember the Egyptians and the Israelis and the building of the pyramids and so forth. America chose to do the same thing after its founding, so we were no different. But there were those in the United States who felt that there was a higher law than that which imposed slavery upon some of its peoples. I'm going to lower this a little bit here. As a result, there were those who would ignore the law and seek to do what they thought was morally correct. Of course, the law being the evils of slavery. One such effort was the Underground Railroad, which of course was neither underground nor a railroad. But the origin of the term is uncertain, from what I've gathered. But once coined, it seemed to rapidly come into common usage. One historian thinks the expression may have originated with a southern planter who, frustrated by the loss of his slave property, said, quote, "The Negro escapes to Canada as easily as if they traveled on a railway which ran beneath the ground," unquote. Nationwide, an organized program to assist runaway slaves may have begun near the end of the 1700s. One story has it that George Washington lamented over one of his runaway slaves who was helped by a group of Quakers. Another source declared, quote, "The Underground Railroad operated as a loosely organized network of people, both black and white, working to help slaves out of slavery into areas of freedom, and lasted from about the 1830s until the 1860s. Minimal documentation makes it difficult to show how many escaped in total, but only a couple hundred would have traveled through Iowa," end of quote. To repeat that source, only a couple hundred would have traveled through Iowa, according to that source. Official records were never kept because the Underground Railroad activities were illegal, and people wanted to minimize their chances for being caught. The movement of fugitive slaves through Iowa may have been romanticized and exaggerated in numbers as the years passed. We have no figures on how many slaves were conveyed through Iowa. The escape networks were said to have lacked formal organization, but agents were ready at their posts, warnings of approaching danger were given, necessary funds were provided, and messages were sent ahead to ready the next station of the impending movements ahead. John C. Parrish, in his 1921 palimpsest article called Underground Railroad in Iowa, said, quote, "The ever-increasing number of fugitive slaves who sought to cross Iowa on their way to freedom brought the Underground Railroad into existence." Quoting another source, armed Missourians with baying bloodhounds often rode close behind escaping slaves. Irate slave owners threatened to shoot or hang those helping the slaves and or burn their buildings. Most of the slaves who moved through Iowa came from Missouri or Kansas, we think. We know that there were many impassioned groups that participated at great risk to themselves and to the fugitives whom they helped in an attempt to send them on to their freedom and safety. Notable groups that supported the efforts of the Underground Railroad in Iowa included Quakers, Wesleyan Methodists, Free Reformed Presbyterians, and Congregationalists. One author wrote, quote, Quaker farmers in Iowa outfitted their houses with crawl spaces, tunnels leading away from cellars, and in one case, an entire floor that lifted to reveal a staircase down to a secret room. Now there were fugitive slave acts. The first one in 1793 provided for the return of runaway slaves, seeking to force authorities in free states to return fugitive slaves to their masters. And as part of the Compromise of 1850, a revised Fugitive Slave Act named the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was passed. It stipulated that when escaped slaves were caught, they had to be returned to their masters, and the officials and citizens of free states had to comply. Slaves were denied the right to a jury trial, and stiffer penalties for noncompliance were imposed. So-called slave catchers were hired by Southerners to search out escaped slaves. So vigilance always had to be maintained on the part of the abolitionists who aided the slaves. One author put it this way: friendly white people told the Negroes they would find Canada by following the North Star and the Drinking Gourd, which was the Big Dipper. An African-American folk song called Follow the Drinking Gourd was first published in 1928. There's a legend that a conductor on the railroad named Peg Leg Joe used the song to guide some of the runaway slaves. I'll explain conductor here. So for some definitions. The Underground Railroad referred to a network of secret routes, of course, as we know, but the term was also applied to abolitionists who aided the fugitives. Conductors were guides who aided the fugitives along the routes. And stations were the hiding places along the way. A number of maps have been constructed to show the routes commonly used in Iowa. The routes were occasionally changed to confuse the slave catchers. The earliest routes of passage through Iowa were in the eastern portion of the state and ran roughly south to north. These routes preceded the west to east route because the eastern part of Iowa was the first to have white settlement. Without a system of stations, conductors, and a mechanism to provide provisions for runaways in the western parts of the state, it would have been impractical to provide for movement there. The small red star that you see here marks the location of Salem, Iowa, where a well-known station was in Henry County, south of us, down in the area by Mount Pleasant. Quakers resided there. From Salem, slaves moved on and crossed the Mississippi River at Muscatine and Burlington. It was in such eastern Iowa places that movement of slaves was the most difficult because there was a denser population and a greater number of persons were opposed to the Underground Railroad. And farther north in Iowa, the towns of DeWitt, Lowmore, and Clinton apparently were also active parts of the system. In his 1921 article, Parrish related the names of many Underground Railroad operatives, such as the Humphreys a few miles south of Tipton. It was Grandpa Humphrey who disguised his passengers by covering them with blankets and put them upon his wagon as if they were bags of grain. One of Iowa's noted Underground Railroad lines began at Tabor, that's in far southwestern Iowa, where Reverend John Todd aided fugitives using his Congregational church as a station. John Brown apparently kept a stash of weapons in Tabor and met with supporters there, perhaps to plan his raids in Kansas and Virginia. A number of other abolitionists lived in Tabor. Parrish said Tabor, quote, was a very important station because here the entire population was in sympathy with escaping slaves, and practically every family was ready to do anything to help the fugitives. I learned some things about John Brown that I didn't know. So let's review him a little bit. He was born in 1800 in western Connecticut, but he moved to northeastern Ohio at age 5. Apparently his father supplied a station for fugitives traveling the Underground Railroad. His father was also a founder of Western Reserve College, which later became part of today's Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland. John moved to Massachusetts and then back to Connecticut, where he hoped to become a congregational minister. But circumstances prevented this, and he returned to Ohio. Did a lot of moving. He married and moved his family to Pennsylvania, where he established a major station on the Underground Railroad, and according to one source, aided in the passing of an estimated 2,500 slaves. After Brown's wife died, he remarried, and they had 13 children. Brown was involved in a tanning business, cattle trading, and horse and sheep breeding. Later, a man named Elijah P. Lovejoy, who was an Alton, Illinois minister down by St. Louis. He was a journalist, also a newspaper editor and abolitionist. He was murdered by a pro-slavery mob in Alton in 1837. And after that, John Brown publicly vowed, quote, "Here before God in the presence of these witnesses, from this time I consecrate my life to the destruction of slavery," end of quote. And later, former President John Quincy Adams said, quote, "The murder gave a shock as of an earthquake throughout this country." Brown moved to Springfield, Massachusetts, where he was deeply involved in the anti-slavery movement. He then spent a couple of years in New York, but moved on to the Kansas territory where he had adult sons. A lot of moving. In what became known as Bleeding Kansas, Brown participated in the Potawatomi Massacre, in which many pro-slavery partisans were hacked to death. A confrontation at Osawatomie followed. Brown then returned to Springfield, Massachusetts, and other parts of the East, raising funds, and a group called the Massachusetts Committee pledged to supply 200 Sharps rifles and ammunition to be stored at Tabor, Iowa. There's a lot more to the John Brown story, but that gives you some of the background leading up to what would become his final journey in the name of abolition. This is a map of John Brown's 1859 Freedom Trail. It's a little small, but it carries him all across Iowa. From Tabor, the fugitives were passed to the east through many communities, one of which was Grinnell. Here is Josiah Grinnell, a prominent Iowan who was among the founders of the town of Grinnell. In addition to his being a minister and a lawyer, Grinnell was an Underground Railroad conductor, an Iowa State senator, a United States representative, a benefactor for Grinnell College, and the director of the Rock Island Railroad. One source revealed that when John Brown stayed 2 days in Grinnell in late February 1859, he developed his plan to attack the U.S. Arsenal in Harper's Ferry. This trip was John Brown's last one through Iowa. It began on February 4th of 1859, when he, his associates, and a group of slaves entered Fremont County in far southwestern Iowa. The journey through Iowa ended more than 1 month later as the group crossed the Mississippi River at Davenport on March 10th. In a boxcar they boarded that morning in West Liberty, near here. As slaves moved eastward, Iowa City was another stopping point with stations located there, or here. This is College Green, just east of downtown Iowa City, with a sign that proudly proclaims its existence since 1839, the year Iowa City was founded. Many of you have been here and seen this sign of the plaque that concerns Iowa City's connection with the Underground Railroad. The wording relates that on February 24th, 1859, John Brown, along with 12 men, women, and children escaping slavery in Missouri, plus Brown's associates, passed through Iowa City on their way to Springdale, about 13 miles east of here. And they stayed there for 2 weeks before continuing by rail to Chicago. After their arrival in Chicago, Allen Pinkerton, the famous detective, took charge of the party of slaves and got them on their way to Detroit, where they soon after moved across the border to Windsor, Ontario, Canada, into freedom. The Mississippi and Missouri Railroad arrived in Iowa City on a frigid New Year's Eve in 1855 and was still the westernmost point of the rail line in this year of 1859 that we're talking about here. This is Mildred Pelzer's mural painted in the 1930s depicting the arrival of the railroad in Iowa City in 1855. This one, along with many others by Mrs. Pelzer, once hung in the lobby or restaurant of the Jefferson Hotel. Does anyone remember them there? Or was that at least one person? Good. I wish I could see better who's out there, but they were there for a period of time. Brown came to Iowa City to meet two abolitionists, according to the sign here, Dr. Jesse Bowen and William Clark, and to make railroad car arrangements. It is believed that Dr. Bowen hid Brown in his home at 914 Iowa Avenue. That would be a home that was probably on the south side of Iowa Avenue, where most of the, let's see, is that? North side, you're right. North sides of east-west streets are usually even, and east sides of north-south streets are usually even. There are some exceptions, especially when you go into the area of out by the cemetery. What am I thinking of? The conclave of Goosetown. There are quite a few irregularities. Some are even mixed, I think, on one side of the street. But that's helpful usually when you want to find an address. Anyway, this home has been torn down, but I think it's fairly well documented that was used as a stopping place, at least for him. The work of Bowen, Clark, and others was controversial, and it was dangerous and illegal. But their dedication to the abolitionist movement drove them to partake in efforts to help slaves along to their freedom. Several other abolitionists were identified in Iowa City, including Governor Samuel Kirkwood and a Colonel Samuel Trowbridge. I'm not sure if that's for whom the Trowbridge Hall is named. But this is the Mr. Kirkwood, whose name is well known for many reasons, the namesake of Kirkwood College, Kirkwood Avenue, and he was Iowa's Civil War governor. Weber wrote, one of the reported stops on his, meaning John Brown's, railroad was a tunnel under the present Bruce Glasgow home. So he's writing in the past when Bruce lived there, which once fronted on Brown, meaning Brown Street. That's the quote. The former home of the late Bruce Glasgow is located at the far north end of Johnson Street, which is just north of Brown Street. Have any of you seen the home? It's said to be quite old, back to the I forget the date, kind of belies its age, but maybe 1850s. Maybe even before. I'm not sure. I'm not remembering too well. But Weber also wrote, quote, the restored and remodeled home that once belonged to banker Downey, and this is the man for whom Downey, Iowa is named, has a cave where the slaves were reportedly hidden. I think Weber was making reference to this home. But anyway, a home on Brown Street, where Downey lived. From Iowa City, the slaves moved on to Springdale, an unincorporated community in Cedar County. The population there was predominantly Quaker, which is not surprising because of the involvement with such groups with the Underground Railroad. One or more stations on the railroad existed there. Springdale is about 16 miles east of here, I think I said. There was a John Painter, who was a Quaker, who moved to a farm near Springdale in 1849. He apparently supplied firearms to John Brown for his use during his raid on Harper's Ferry. And Brown stayed at Painter's home while he was preparing for his raid, whereas his associates lived and trained in this home, the William Maxson House, which is no longer in existence. One source even said that Brown had relatives in Cedar County, including cousins who taught at the Tipton Union School. In Margaret Poston's book called This is the Place, Iowa, she tells of two brothers, Edwin and Barclay Coppock of Springdale, who joined John Brown in 1859 to move east to participate in the raid on the Arsenal, which was in Virginia at that time. It's now West Virginia. John Brown and most of his associates were captured at Harper's Ferry, and most of them were tried, convicted, and hanged, including John Brown himself. Edwin Coppock was captured and hanged, but his brother Barclay returned to Springdale and served in the Army. And it's written that the governor of Virginia wanted Coppock extradited but Governor Kirkwood of Iowa refused based on quote-unquote technical grounds. Here's today's view of the very picturesque Harper's Ferry, West Virginia. And here's a replica of the engine house that was stormed by Lieutenant Colonel Robert E. Lee when Brown and his followers were captured. Colonel Robert E. Lee, of course, was later General Lee. He was initially offered the command of the Union Army, but he relented, vowing to serve as native Virginia, which joined the Confederacy in 1861. So he resigned his Union from the Union Army. I want to talk about the Terrell Dam and grist mill, which seems to be a little bit off topic, but it digresses a bit, but there is a possible tie-in. Plus, I'd like to take the opportunity just to talk about this interesting part of our city's history. I've read that grist mills were often used as stations, and the miller would be an abolitionist in that case. Walter Terrell may have been one such sympathizer. Terrell had Quaker ties, and he also married Quaker women. And he had a close friend in Springdale, Laurie Tatum. Tatum was an active conductor on the Underground Railroad, so it's plausible that the Terrell Mill was a station, but there's no conclusive evidence of this. Terrell began the construction of a dam and flour mill on the Iowa River in 1843, 4 years after the founding of the city. It was located perhaps just a little north of Mayflower Hall. The territorial legislature of Iowa granted him the privilege of constructing the mill and using water power. The dam had a western and an eastern portion, each running from shore to an island. He operated his mill until the late 1860s. And the road running by his mill was first called the Foster Road, later the Red Ball Route, still later Highway 218, and finally North Dubuque Street. Here's another view of the Terrell Dam and grist mill. You can see lettering on the side of the building. If you can make it out, it says Hawthorne glove, something about the Hawthorne gloves. I wonder if he charged them for advertising for that. The dam was removed in 1906 when the Burlington Street Dam was built. This image shows two of the stone, what are called stone burrs, B-U-R-R-S, with their roughened surfaces that were used to grind grain in Terrell's grist mill. The plaque that shows the Lions Club symbol is a tribute to Irving Weber. And the stones and plaque are both located in Terrell Mill Park, which is the green space just west of Mayflower Hall, between Dubuque Street and the river. And the park occupies land that once had the Terrell grist mill. Now, some of you remember this house. Terrell built his mansion, this house, near the bluff east of today's Mayflower Hall. It's now called Mayflower Hall, the residence there. After years of use as a residence, a woman, possibly a Mrs. Dunham, operated a dining service from the home beginning in the mid-1920s, according to Weber. And she called her business the Red Ball Inn for the adjacent highway. Mrs. Dunham did mostly special parties with luncheon clubs. At one time, the Red Ball Inn was called the Mayflower Nightclub. The grandmother of my friend Ruth Hesseltine, here in the first row, was the head cook at the establishment for many years. Did I get it right, Ruth? Mr. and Mrs. Jake Kobes purchased the home with its 3.5 acres, repaired and remodeled it, and named it the Mayflower. Mrs. Kobes painted a picture of the Mayflower home and displayed it on a wall in the home. Here you can see, it's a little hard to see perhaps, but a Mayflower, it says right at the top of the front of the house. Two families in succession operated the Mayflower as a key club, serving private parties until perhaps 1951. And from 1951 to 1966, the home continued to cater private parties, but soon after was torn down to make way for the Mayflower Apartments. It's now Mayflower Hall. And there is the current Mayflower Hall. Now, what about possible Iowa City stations? There are many legends concerning homes in Iowa City that were stops on the Underground Railroad. And I think many of you may have something to speak up about. Unfortunately, it's a very difficult thing to substantiate. I gathered information from several press citizen write-ups that points to some locations believed to have been used to hide runaway slaves. Pat and John Hayek, is it Hayek or Hayek? Hayek were told by descendants of the people who built their house that it was a stop on the Underground Railroad. A possible station may have existed at the Englert Pownell House at 1602 North Dubuque Street. John Hayek remembered seeing a kind of cave back behind the house, quote, where everyone said the slaves were hidden. That these two homes were stations, however, only have legend as a basis for their claims. And why is that? Well, we'll explain a little bit more, but I think I've already alluded to that. Also, William Penn Clark and Dr. Jesse Bowen, whom I mentioned earlier, may have protected runaway slaves in their homes. So to repeat from my previous statement, because helping runaway slaves was illegal, records were usually not kept. So the identification of possible stations remains obscure. As one example, here is a home that some of you have probably seen on Davenport, the Captain Irish home. It talks about here, this was an advertisement by a realtor, built in Iowa City by a named Captain Irish, a Nantucket whaler, how he got his name, who settled here and built Rose Hill in 1849. It is said the house was on the Underground Railroad. It is said. Captain Irish was Frederick Irish, and he named his home Rose Hill and the area around it, quite an acreage. It's also known as the Irish Getz home, and it is occupied to this day. Now, what about underground railroad stations in Iowa that are in existence today? According to one source, there are but 5 underground railroad stations that one can still visit, but we do have some documented places. Here's the Reverend George B. Hitchcock House in Lewis. I'll show you on a map where these towns are in a moment. 2 rooms were in the basement, one of them a secret one, separated by a hinged cupboard. The cupboard could be swung open to gain access. It's been recognized as a National Park Service Underground Railroad Network to Freedom Site. The house was built around 1855. Hitchcock gave sanctuary to escaped slaves in this home, and he may have used his wife's and daughter's clothing to dress the fugitives before their transport over the river. The property was farmed until 1966, when the state of Iowa acquired it. The home was restored in the 80s and is now used as a historic house museum managed by Cass County. It's open for tours, and you can find stuff on a website about that. Here is the Pearson House in Keosauqua. It's maintained by the Van Buren County Historical Society, built in the 1845 to 1847 era. It's constructed of both stone and brick. And the second floor was originally one big room used for Methodist church services. Here's another view of the house. There is a hideaway under the floor that was reached via a trapdoor. Here is the Todd House in Tabor, Iowa. Tabor is in far southwestern Iowa that I've spoken of, near the Missouri River. It was the home of Reverend John Todd, a Congregationalist minister, built in 1853, about the time that Reverend Todd co-founded Tabor College and the town of Tabor. And John Brown visited this home prior to his final trek eastward across Iowa on the way to his raid on Harper's Ferry. Next, we have the James Jordan House in West Des Moines. It was built by James Jordan, a cattle farmer from Virginia, who was believed to be the chief conductor in Polk County, of the underground, that is. It's one of the oldest structures in Polk County and the oldest in West Des Moines, with its construction beginning in 1850. It operates as the Jordan House Museum that houses the office of the West Des Moines Historical Society as part of the 16-room structure. Finally, we have the Henderson Llewellyn House, located in Salem, which is the one south of us, in Henry County, south of Mount Pleasant. Llewellyn was a Quaker farmer who moved to Iowa in 1837, 2 years before Iowa City was founded, and he established a nursery business. He built the house in the early 1840s. It contained features for hiding runaway slaves on the Underground Railroad, even though one source said it is not certain that slaves were hidden in the house. Llewellyn and his wife were ousted from the Salem Monthly Meeting of Friends. And you might ask why. The Society of Friends opposed slavery, but some of the members were opposed to actually harboring slaves. So a schism occurred in the local society, leading to the ousting. So this shows, if you can kind of see, where the locations of these 5 houses that can be visited are. Those who aided in runaway slaves as well were subject to prosecution under the fugitive slave laws, so they were at risk if caught. I haven't uncovered cases of prosecution of persons aiding runaway slaves in Iowa, but a friend brought a case to my attention from nearby Illinois. A Dr. Richard Eels of Quincy was a well-known abolitionist who harbored slaves in the Underground Railroad network. He was said to have aided several hundred slaves. In 1842, he was caught helping an escaped slave, and he was arrested and charged with harboring and secreting a fugitive slave under the Illinois Criminal Code. Judge Stephen A. Douglas heard the case the following year and fined him $400, which is about $12,000 in today's money. He appealed the case all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, but the High Court upheld the sentence. This book, called Necessary Courage, Iowa's Underground Railroad in the Struggle Against Slavery, by Lowell Soike, was published just 7 years ago. Soike discussed his book in an interview with Charity Nebbe, and Doug Jones of the State Historic Preservation Office also contributed to the discussion. And the following comes from that discussion. The earliest settlers in southern Iowa in the 1840s were from Kentucky, Tennessee, and other states that had sentiments that supported slavery, or at least were not anti-abolitionist. However, there were many abolitionists who did settle there in the very early days, people like Quakers and Congregationalists. When Soike began his research, he found only a number of unconnected stories here and there concerning Iowa and the Underground Railroad. He found some newspaper accounts, often negative views by the Democratic press of the activities of runaways who were captured. In other words, the press was often pro-slavery. Certainly the conductors and others involved with aiding the runaways did not want their stories openly confessed. So there's not much written during the days of the operation of the Underground Railroad. Later, such things as biographical sketches of individuals who had passed away would reveal their past involvement. Most of the runaways made their way from Iowa toward Chicago and some on to Canada. The big somebodies, quote unquote, in Iowa communities, the doctors, the lawyers, etc., often the consistently elected leaders, were often the people who would be helping the runaways. Soike hopes that the book will bring out some family recollections and bring them to our attention. Diaries would be most helpful to uncover some of these things. As far as research efforts currently on the Iowa Underground Railroad, the Iowa Department of Cultural Affairs website has this to say, this is a quote, "The Iowa Freedom Trail project began in 2002 when the National Park Service's Network to Freedom program provided grant funding to the Iowa Network to Freedom project, which researched people and places associated with the Underground Railroad in Iowa. Grant funding ended in 2013, but volunteers continue to gather information from historical resources and compile it into a form containing general information, including biographical data, resource references, associated properties, and researcher information. The information is accessible at the Library and Archives Research Center at the State Historical Building in Des Moines. We have 2 State Historical Society buildings, one in Des Moines and the one in Iowa City. So, in summarizing, the history of the Underground Railroad in Iowa is rather sketchy. Some of the homes reputed to be stations had dubious uses as such. John Brown, the noted fiery abolitionist, had a major presence in Iowa during his period, something unknown to many of us Iowans. The number of slaves helped on their way via the Underground Railroad in Iowa is unknown, but undoubtedly rather low. Some scholars estimate the numbers to be in the hundreds, while others more than 1,000. Some accounts of hiding runaways in Iowa speak of underground cellars and trapdoors, but more frequently speak of concealment in attics, garrets, haymows, outdoor timber, and heavy underbrush. The Iowa Underground Railroad effort was a bold one, and many runaway slaves were helped by many courageous Iowans. Thank you much.